Hey noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today I would like to talk more about the concept of women warriors, but specifically from the perspective of the ancient sources. I think the concept of women warriors is a fascinating one because of the rarity of the phenomenon. Of course, as I've mentioned many times on this channel, in the majority of cases throughout history, it was men that went to war, not women. And of course, some of this has to do with the biological differences between men and women, aka sexual dimorphism. But regardless of that, I think that sometimes the people that mention this, particularly when they go into the hypothetical, they point at history and then they say, it basically never happened that you had women warriors, or if it did happen, it was such an exceptional rarity that doesn't have any statistical significance at a numerical level. It is also true that people that say this, I don't think they've ever actually seen the sources, because we do have mentions of women warriors, and whenever they do happen in history, we are told how they performed, so we don't need to speculate when it comes to this. We don't need to come down to percentage of this, percentage of that, and body mass and strength and eye-to-hand coordination and whatnot. We have the ancients, and as far as I'm concerned, I believe the ancients. So how about we jump into the actual documented sources so that we can formulate and have an informed opinion. If the figure of Celtic warrior women is indeed a trope, now rooted in the collective imagination, partly due to cinematography, we are probably dealing with a forced and specious interpretation of historical sources in this specific case. These sources certainly offer us the image of female figures who were more independent compared to those of the classical world, but who did not embrace a true widespread warrior tradition. Now, the warrior woman is a recurring figure in Irish mythology, for example. However, upon closer analysis, it quickly becomes clear that this is not a realistic element, but rather something filled with allegorical and initiatory characteristics. To begin with, the majority of the women who are warriors within Irish mythology, well, are not from Ireland. They always come from another nation or territory, from Scotland, Britain, or even Scythia, to emphasize a sense of otherness. Moreover, within these myths, these women warriors always tend to have some form of supernatural characteristic that defines them, less as a normal human and more sort of semi-divine beings, or once again mythological entities. For example, the warrior Dornolla, who falls in love with the Celtic hero, I'll just put it on screen, I don't know how to pronounce it, originally from Scotland, as her feet are reversed, with her heels facing outward and her toes inward, a characteristic that recalls inversion, which in Celtic folklore is typical of fairy beings. In other words, these are not real women, they are mythological archetypes. In particular, in myth, the function of the warrior woman is almost always to instruct the hero, the protagonist of the story, in martial arts, secret moves, and superlative and unknown combat techniques. Through their teachings, the warrior is reborn a hero. From a common fighter, he becomes a heroic fighter, a champion, and therefore necessarily the figure that allows the warrior to carry forward this path must be female, as it is a form of second birth. So, upon closer inspection, these women warriors do not represent the everyday reality of the Irish people, but on the contrary, they are allegorical figures of the world of legends. The accounts of the classics have certainly contributed to some extent to the creation of the figure of the Celtic warrior woman. Celtic women, more independent in some respects than Greek and Roman women, had struck the imagination of the Mediterranean people, who, in some cases, described them in great detail. However, if we analyze their writings professionally, we realize that the classics never explicitly speak of a properly warrior woman as far as the Celts are concerned. The first figure that stands out from the chronicles is certainly that of Bodika, the queen of the Iceni, a Celtic people of Britain whom she leads into battle, revolting against the Romans. Now, of course, Bodika's abilities as a tactician, as a strategist, are renowned. They are, in fact, impressive. Bodika is described by Tacitus as leading her troops from the top of a war chariot into battle. But rather than a warrior woman, the picture that emerges is that of a woman leader, which is, of course, different. Therefore, we are talking about a queen, an exponent of the noble class, not a common Celtic woman, and who is also a widow and has become at the moment the only point of reference for her people in an exceptional moment of crisis, which has led the Iceni to clash against their previous allies, namely the Romans. Thus, we are, historically speaking, of a very particular figure in a very specific context. That is, of course, the opposite of the norm. There is then a passage which is often used to leverage the interpretation of Celtic warrior women by Manius Marinus. So let's read it. Almost all the Gauls are of tall stature, fair and ruddy, terrible for the fierceness of their eyes, fond of quarreling and of overbearing insolence. In fact, a whole band of foreigners will be unable to cope with one of them in a fight if he calls in his wife, stronger than he by far and with flashing eyes, least of all when she swells her neck and gnashes her teeth, and poising her huge white arms, proceeds to rain punches mingled with kicks, like shots discharged by the twisted cords of a catapult. To give you a little bit of context, in this specific passage, Ammianus is writing in the 4th century AD, and he's talking about a specific area of Gaul, which is Transalpine Gaul, which has been Roman for over 350 years. And we are clearly facing a passage that is deliberately satirical and comical. The Romans would have loved this. But it does not describe a combat or a battle, but a sort of brawl with kicks and punches, and which, if anything, can be used to emphasize how, in the eyes of the Romans, the women of Northern Europe were of an indomitable and violent nature, and were much less composed than the solemn Roman matrons. Remember, whenever we read something, we also need to know as much as possible about the people who write, their culture, their preconceptions. Because if you don't do that, then you're going to apply your own filters and read it differently to what it actually was meant to be. Regarding the Bracari people, from what we know, Junius Brutus devastated their villages, just to give you a little closing on that story. There is, however, a passage in Plutarch that could be really interesting when it comes to the idea of could a woman, if she had to, be effective in combat up to a certain extent. In Plutarch we read about the women of the Cimbri people, the Teutons and the Ambrones, who at the Battle of Aquae Sextiae in 102 BC defend their wagons, pushing back their own fleeing men and trying to repel the Roman legionaries. Let's read the passage. Here the women met them, swords and axes in their hands, and with hideous shrieks of rage tried to drive back fugitives and pursuers alike. The fugitives as traitors and the pursuers as foes, they mixed themselves up with the combatants, with bare hands tore away the shields of the Romans or grasped their swords, and endured wounds and mutilations, their fierce spirit unvanquished to the end. But let me give you a little extra further context. It should be noted that the Celtic and Germanic women are in a camp consisting of wagons. They are not deployed on the battlefield, and they intervene in an exceptional moment, namely when what are objectively their homes are directly threatened, in what is a desperate defense. Similarly, in Appian we read of the Bracari people of Galicia, whose women fight, we read, open quote, bearing arms with the men. Appian, Spanish Wars, 1272. Also, in the case of the Bracari, the women arm themselves when Junius Brutus assaults their villages, again in an exceptional situation. So we're not facing a specific cultural warrior characteristic of the Celtic and Germanic women, but rather a reaction in a moment of maximum crisis that could manifest itself in any context of the ancient age. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. If the idea of a rooted tradition of women warriors within the populations of Central and Northern Europe appears to be unlikely, on the contrary, there are many more elements to support their presence women warriors within the populations of the steppes of Eurasia, in an area that, not coincidentally, Greek myths connects with the Amazons. Now, according to Herodotus, the Amazons were originally from the city of Themyscira in Pontus, today's Terme in Turkey. And just for those who struggle a little bit with Roman provinces, so when we say Pontus, you have to imagine that area of Turkey that is in the north and it's facing the Black Sea, whereas, for example, the Roman province of Cilicia, or Kilikia in ancient Greek, but whatever, Cilicia would be instead the south and would be facing the Mediterranean. Cilicia being the same area where, for example, the Apostle Paul was from. He was a Roman citizen. Defeated and massacred in battle by the Greeks, the few surviving Amazon had been crammed onto 3 ships to be taken into slavery in Greece, but having freed themselves during the journey, they had killed all their tormentors and taken possession of the vessels. However, knowing nothing about navigation, they found themselves adrift in the Black Sea, eventually landing along the coasts of the Meotian swamp, that is, the Sea of Azov in Eurasia. Settled in the hinterland, the Amazons would have clashed several times with the local populations, the nomadic people of the Scythians, until the two parties reached an agreement. Some young Scythians would marry the Amazons, but allowing their wives to maintain their customs, thus remaining free to go into battle and ride horses. The young Scythians and the Amazons would thus give birth to a new people, the Sarmatians, who would have moved northeast on the Tanais River, that is, the Don. Writing about the Sauromatae people, another Greek author, specifically Hippocrates, recalls among their customs that these women would remain virgin and go into battle riding horses, throwing the javelin and shooting with the bow, and how it was tradition for them to give themselves to a man only after having killed at least 3 enemies in combat. After marriage, the bellicosity of Sarmatian women tended to decrease, but they still maintained the tradition of going into battle in case of exceptional operations. Now, of course, if the Anatolian origin of Sarmatian women as reported by Herodotus should be considered myth or legend, and should be linked to the Homeric myth that would have the Amazons participating in the Trojan War alongside King Priam, on the contrary, the presence of warrior women within the Indo Iranian cultures of the Eurasian steppes would seem to be confirmed by archaeological data, which presents with some recurrence female burials that display military kits, usually consisting of a reflex bow, arrows, sagaris, which is an Indo Iranian war pickaxe-like, and swords, sometimes also spears and scale armor, and not, in this case, just for the nobles, so that's different. Now, if the presence of weapons within female burials does not, as we have explained, automatically mean their dynamic use by the buried woman and could have a symbolic value, in the case of the Indo-Iranian world of the Eurasian steppes, this is accompanied by literary references that often speak of women warriors, and above all, by osteological data showing that the buried women have in many cases sustained injuries, a sign of recurrent participation in violent context. So it is very probable that even though Amazons are of course a myth, they were based on a reality that probably impressed the ancient peoples, such as the Greeks, that were not used to it, because as we said, in Europe they were less common. And this, differently from what people say, can be corroborated by not only the material goods in burial references, but also description and osteological record. But we are not done, because we've got Casio Dio. According to Casio Dio, during the Marcomannic Wars, which ranged in the second half of the 2nd century AD, many Germans from beyond the Rhine fell upon the heart of the Roman Empire, even managing to sack Italy, where they were confronted and repelled by Emperor Marcus Aurelius, thanks to his lieutenant Pertinax and Pompeianus. What we are told in the sources is that following the clashes, we're told by Dio, that Romans found among the corpses of their enemies several women in armor. We read, "Many of the Germans, too, from across the Rhine, advanced as far as Italy and inflicted many injuries upon the Romans. They were in turn attacked by Marcus, who opposed to them his lieutenant Pompeianus and Pertinax, and Pertinax, who later became emperor, greatly distinguished himself. Among the corpses of the barbarians there were found even women's bodies in armor. This is Casio Dio from the Epitome of Roman History. So rather than hypothesizing the presence of warrior women among the Germans, these armed women, of which Dio writes, are to be tracked back to another people, that the Iazyges. The Iazyges were a Sarmatian population who had settled in the Carpathian Basin in the first half of the 1st century AD, thus coming into contact with the Germans. The relationships between the Iazyges and the Germans seem to be very proactive, and in particular the Iazyges seem to have contributed to the birth of the Regnum Vaniarum, a proto-state formation that included Slovakia and Bohemia, promoted by the king of the Germanic people of the Quadi Vanius, consisting of the Germanic nations of the Quadi and the Marcomanni, and several tribes of Sarmatian Iazyges. From Tacitus we learn that in 50 AD, King Vanius' cavalry was indeed made up of Iazyges warriors who were women, and more than 100 years later, when Quadi, Marcomanni, and many other Germanic tribes following King Ballomar hurled themselves against the empire, the Iazyges were in fact at their side. The warrior women, of which Casio Dio speaks, should therefore be ascribed to this specific Sarmatian reality. There are two further historical references to the presence of warrior women in the ancient age, and they are circumscribed to the 3rd century AD. In the Historia Augusta we read that Aurelian, in 274 AD, celebrated an imposing triumph in Rome, parading elements belonging to all the people and all the kingdoms he had faced and defeated. Among them, we have something interesting that is mentioned. Let's read it. Also 10 women who, fighting in male attire, had been captured among the Goths after many others had fallen. These a placard declared to be of the race of the Amazons, for placards were born before all, displaying the names of their nations. Once again, even in this case, instead of trying to trace a Germanic tradition of women warriors, we should see the origin of these captives to be once again Sarmatian. As historian Urs Mallers writes, the Goths during their migration towards the southeast and their settlement along the coasts of the Black Sea had come into contact with the Sarmatians, by whom they had been deeply influenced, so much so as to even give rise to a sort of partial mutual assimilation. There is another reference, this time coming from Zonoras, who speaks about the presence of women warriors within the Sassanid Empire, specifically the Persian Emperor Shapur. We read, in the Persian army, it is said that women were also identified, dressed and armed like men. This passage can be interpreted in two ways. It's kind of a little bit of a twofold interpretation. Either these are Sarmatian women in origin that have assimilated within the Sassanid Empire and now joined the warrior corps, or it's a remnant of an ancient Indo Iranian tradition that was already part of the Sassanid reality. Now, the latter option, it's tempting, but appears to be the least probable. In the Parthian world, we have the memory of Utab, the sister of the Persian general Ariobarzanes, who, in arms, would have defended with her brother the pass of the Persian gates against Alexander the Great in 330 BC. Now, her figure, besides belonging to the Achaemenid past, seems to be more mythical than real, and the fact that Utab in Persian means unique could be a clue that underlines a peculiarity of a woman fighting and not a customary nature. So, the presence of these fighting force that was female in the Sassanid Empire is probably once again of Sarmatian origin. In the 6th century AD, Procopius of Caesarea reports the presence of warrior women among the ranks of the Huns. Let's read it. On many occasions, when the Huns made raids into Roman territory and were confronted by those who encountered them, some obviously were killed, and after the barbarians retreated, the Romans, searching the bodies of the fallen, found women among them. This is from the book Wars of Justinian. So the Huns also had women warriors, although we do need to understand that Procopius in this way is using the term Huns in a very generalized sense. In fact, sometimes he indicates tyrannic populations, such as the Kutrigurs and the Utigurs, or Indo Iranian populations who lived in the very vast area between the Caucasus and the shores of the Black Sea. So which Huns had the women warriors? Kind of difficult to identify. People of the eastern steppes. We have to consider the highly turbulent, volatile, and changeable nature of the hordes that were born and died, fragmented and federated into the steppes of Eurasia during the late ancient age. It is very difficult to clearly identify the ethnicity of the Huns mentioned by Procopius. The very concept of ethnicity in those contexts was incredibly volatile and subject to sudden changes, and already Attila's Huns, a reality prior to the one mentioned by Procopius, were actually the results of a mixture of various elements, where a numerically small Germanic/Mongolic elite dominated over a melting pot of Sarmatian and Germanic peoples. There is another less known story, and the reason why it's less known is because it's not compatible with the Celtic Nordic warrior woman, but I think it's still interesting, is the story of the Greek poetress Tesil of Argos in Greece. Let's read it. When Cleomenes, king of the Spartans, having slain many Argives, proceeds against the city, an impulsive daring, divinely inspired, came to the younger women to try, for their country's sake, to hold off the enemy. Under the lead of Telesilla, they took up arms and, taking their stand by the battlements, manned the walls all around so that the enemy were amazed. The result was that Cleomenes they repulsed with great loss, and the other king, Demaratus, who managed to get inside, as Socrates says, and gain possession of the Pamphyliacum, they drove out. In this way, the city was saved. The women who fell in the battle, they buried close by the Argive road, and to the survivors, they granted the privilege of erecting a statue of Ares as a memorial of their surpassing valor. This is really interesting because did they die? Yes. But did they manage to repel the men? Yes. So, of course, this doesn't mean that women versus men is an equal combat situation. It is not. Men have the advantage. But we also shouldn't underestimate the possibility that even in hand-to-hand ancient combat, as the sources tell us, women can be an asset, particularly when added together with the men in a situation of absolute crisis. And we are told that they did, in fact, act successfully in repelling the enemy attacks. Moreover, the weapons used by Telesilla and the Argive women, according to another passage of the Moralia, are extemporaneously taken from the sanctuaries, where they composed the trophies that celebrated the past victories of the city, according to a tradition common to many people of antiquity. So these are not, as one should expect, professional women warriors, but once again, it's a situation of improvised combat. But it also kind of underlines the fact that weapons are indeed equalizers. They're not absolute equalizers until you get to, I would imagine, ranged weapons and firearms, of course, but they can be equalizers in the sense that if the same battle happened with just hand-to-hand, this would not have happened. But when you give a spear, which also helps with the range advantage, particularly if the woman is shorter and the man is taller, but now you have a spear, or even a sword, is a weapon that can change the odds in favor of the weaker side. The idea of using improvised weapons is also not uncommon. When weapons were not available nearby, they would be recovered from, say, the fallen, or from sacred installation, or to be snatched from the enemy. And in these cases, women used opportunistic weapons, as it is with the axes of the Cimbrian women. We also have a mention in Plutarch that is significant. Plutarch tells us that an old Argive woman hurled at the king Pyrrhus of Epirus while he was intent on fighting against her son, killing him. Of course, he was distracted, but many things can go wrong, and there are a multitude of variables whenever we discuss combat. It isn't just a matter of, if you have more people, you win against less people. If you're stronger, you always win against who is weaker. There are a lot of variables in combat, as the ancients tell us. Finally, I would like to now explore the topic of the archaeological data, which is sometimes presented as a way to support the idea of women warriors being common. They existed, but they weren't common. The idea of a conspicuous presence of warrior women within Celtic culture is not supported by the archaeological evidence. Even in this case, however, the data must be analyzed in a sophisticated and not specious or romantic manner. One of the most common examples is that of the burial of the Ricana of Oleggio. This is a female burial from northern Italy, from Oleggio, Piedmont, in the territory of the Vartamocori Gauls. Northern Italy at this time was Gallic territory. This is subsequent to the entry of northern Italy into the orbit of the Roman Republic and presents a military trousseau composed of sword, shield boss, spearhead, and large knife as a ceremonial burial or funerary kit. As in the case of Bodika, we are not dealing with a common Celtic woman, but with an exponent of the highest strata of society. In one of the ceramics that make up the funerary kit, we find engraved the words Ricanas, meaning queen. The woman buried in Oleggio was the head of her community, and as such had to show its symbols, which we know within Celtic culture are military, because there is a direct channel between military equipment and social prestige. Now, whether or not the Regana of Oleggio, this woman that was buried with military gear and equipment, was actually familiar with it, or whether it was just a status symbol, we will never know. In the same way, those female burials occasionally present in Celtic or Celticized areas that show weapons inside should be treated with a little suspicion. We will never know if the noble woman buried on the island of Braia, for example, or the women buried with weapons that are occasionally found in the Celticized cultures in Poland actually use them frequently in life. These could be elements exclusively linked to burial modalities and have a particular symbolism, or perhaps they could be elements linked to a father, a son, a husband, or even status markers, as explained. So the important thing is that whenever we approach a burial situation, an archaeological, when we have material evidence and we see the bones of a woman together with armor and weapons, after we establish that this is a noble woman, we don't know. Maybe she was familiar with it, maybe she knew how to use them, maybe not. As for the Battle of Aquas Scythia, it seems that the resistance of the Ambrones women was effective in its own way, in the sense that, for that day, Plutarch writes, as we read, "After destroying many of the Ambrones, the Romans withdrew and night came on." And to clarify, I will put the entire passage in the video description and on screen right now for you to double check. But there is a little section that I want to read. "After destroying many of the Ambrones, the Romans withdrew and night came on. But in spite of so great a success, the army did not indulge in paeans of victory, or drinking in the tents, or friendly converse over suppers, or that sweetest of delights for men who have fought and won a battle, gentle sleep. But that night, more than any other, was spent in fears and commotions, for their camp was still without palisade or wall, and there were still left many myriads of the barbarians who had met with no defeat." So, did the Romans defeat these people, whether it be their men running away, whether it be their women fighting? Yes, they did, of course. This is the most professional army on the planet, and yet, even them still knew that there were many left, men and women, and because they didn't have palisades, they had to be very careful, because these people could be dangerous. Give a weapon to someone, they can still be dangerous, and you have to be in high alert. That, however, it's not how it ended, so just to let you know how the whole thing ended, the clash with the Ambrones is actually the prelude. A few days later, there will be the decisive clash, and Gaius Marius will win over the Teutons, the Ambrones, and the unspecified Gallic allies. So they were afraid, but yeah, they won. Of course, they won. The Romans won. I would like to now close with probably the most interesting hypothetical idea that I wanted to present in front of you. Now, do you remember that as we were reading Casio Dio, we read about the Iazyges and how they were defeated by the Romans, and then they found, oh gosh, these were women, the cavalry women that they were fighting in armor. All of this following the Marcomannic Wars. Now, what's interesting is that after defeating them, the Romans require and impose reparations. What do I mean by that? Well, the Iazyges are forced to provide the Roman army with 8,000 horsemen who would have served as auxiliaries, or numeri, a term that in the Roman army indicated irregular formations, alongside the legionaries. Of these 8,000 horsemen, Casio Dio continues, 5,500 had been stationed in Britain, and from England comes a surprising discovery that emerged during the excavation carried out in the 1960s on the site of Bragam, the ancient fortified camp of Brocavum, near Hadrian's Wall. Check this out. At a cemetery site that was excavated, in which the remains of 120 individuals were found, we see these burials contained weapons and mounts that was partially cremated. So these were cavalrymen. Now, the methods of deposition do not seem particularly compatible with a properly Roman reality, and on the contrary, we find points of contact with the Indo Iranian world of the Eurasian steppes. But the most incredible thing, however, is that at least some of these individuals were indeed women, and they had mounts and weapon. So it is very probable that these, because of the connections that we made up to now, were some of these auxiliary cavalrymen that were given to the Romans as a form of reparations by the people called Iazyges, And as you can see, some of them were indeed women warriors in armor. Now, I hope that you found all of this fascinating, but it is important, I think, whenever we talk about history and combat and warrior, not to make absolute statements. I've seen people in the comments telling me, oh, a woman can never defeat a man. If you give a spear to a man and a spear to a woman, the woman will always lose. A woman couldn't wear armor, a woman couldn't, and all of these other hypotheticals. But the reality is that when we see combat like Hima or Japanese martial arts, sometimes when weapons are included in the equation, women will win against a stronger man, particularly depending on what type of weapon we're talking about. Of course, these are exceptions. In the majority of cases, men have the advantage, and that is a biological fact. But when we talk about history, it's important to underline that yes, there have been situations in which women did go to war. Not so much in Western Europe, very, very occasionally, as we saw today, in situations of crisis. But when it comes to the steppes or the populations of Eurasia or Indo Iranian populations, this was actually more common than many people are ready to admit or that many people know. And of course, we could also jump into other realities, such as, for example, the women warriors that we find in the Kingdom of Kush, or the Kandake, so the black warrior queens that I've already spoken about a little bit. So all in all, the message of all of this is, we all agree, men are stronger than women in hand-to-hand combat. With weapons, men still have the advantage. But let's not say that it never happened that women were deployed as professional soldiers, as cavalry, as archers, heck, even as snipers from the Soviet Union, because they were and they can be effective in some contexts, as the ancients tell us. It is false that women cannot wear armor, or the women cannot march, or the women are not able to function as effective military. They are not as effective as men, but let's make sure we don't push the pendulum too far and state categorical ideas that then don't work when you actually read the sources. Anyways, let me know what you think, dear noble ones, and as always, thank you so much for watching. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.